walking by. Yeah, it's the first time I've done a night show. Hi everyone, welcome back to the Navigant Credit Union Broadcast Center. I'm GoLocal News editor Kate Nagel. Thanks for joining us for coverage this Wednesday evening for primary elections across the state. I want to thank Rob Horowitz and Joseph Molina Flynn for coming in, and now I've got my next guest. Matt Guardino, professor of political science at Providence College. Thank you for coming in today.
Hi, thank you.
And Representative Anthony Giarrusso, my Republican voice here in studio. Thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you for having me. It's a pleasure.
Okay, well, we are awaiting results. They're starting to come in the Board of Elections site, so we're still going to be a bit in the prognostication side of things. But Matt, being a professor of political science, let's take a look at some of the races that have garnered some national attention. Between Governor Gina Raimondo and Matt Brown, we were talking earlier about her having this formidable war chest, and of course Matt basically putting forth a very grassroots campaign, very much in the Bernie Sanders vein. Are you surprised at how much effort the governor has put out for this sort of upstart challenger?
I actually am a little bit surprised at that, in particular because Brown is, as you mentioned, underfunded, I think to say the least. And as an incumbent, with the resources that an incumbent has, I was a bit surprised at how seriously the Raimondo campaign seems to be taking Brown's challenge. Noticed a lot of advertising against Brown, particularly recent days and recent weeks, and that to me signals that they really see a potential threat there.
And let's talk a little bit Lieutenant Governor's campaign, Aaron Regunberg, Dan McKee. That's going to be, I think, a close one too.
That one might be in some sense even a little bit more interesting, just because I think Regunberg is got more funding and also some endorsements that are important that may make that race a bit more competitive. Although, of course, people don't tend to get too excited about the lieutenant governor's race in comparison to the gubernatorial race. But that will be interesting for sure.
You know, what's interesting is you talk about the lieutenant governor's race. A couple of times, I do believe Dan McKee did point out the age of Aaron Regunberg as opposed to his experience. I know it's on the Democratic side of things, Representative, but should age matter?
No, definitely not. As Ronald Reagan once said, I won't use my opponent's youth and inexperience against them.
So we're keeping an eye on the close races. Let's talk a little bit about on the Republican side of things. What have you been hearing for turnout? Obviously, Republicans represent a smaller but very powerful faction here in Rhode Island. What have you heard on numbers today as far as turnout is concerned?
Yeah, it's been stunning. You know, depending on who you talk to, how many people would normally vote in a Republican primary that might vote in a Democratic primary just to vote against someone. So it's more like defense rather than offense, which I find that to be, I'm not crazy about that because you really should be voting for who you want.
So have you heard from a lot, and now this is, I know, very anecdotal. I happened to hear from someone in Providence, who'll remain unnamed. He said he is an independent, was going in the Democratic to vote for Matt Brown, said he was going to disaffiliate and vote for whoever emerged from the Republican. Are you hearing a lot of Republican-leaning voters doing the same?
I've heard, I'm not going to say a lot, but I've heard quite a bit of that. And I just think it's unfortunate because, then what if you don't get the person that you really wanted in the party that you normally vote on because you went and voted against someone else on the other side?
I mean, have you really heard of the strategy in sort of all your years in politics?
Oh, I've heard it a number of times, and I'm sure that's why election laws make it so you have to choose one or the other, so you can't go offense on one and defense on the other.
And so let's talk a little bit about other races as well. I want to talk with you, Matt, a little bit about the mayor's race here in Providence. Jorge Elorza is facing Democratic challengers from Bob DeRobio and Kobe Dennis. Now, a well-funded challenger, Dee Dee Whitman, is going to be entering as an independent. She said she's going to put $500,000 towards her campaign. Like any other election that we're looking at this evening, does it matter how close it is in the primary as a referendum on how that candidate will potentially fare in the general?
I think it can matter. I think it depends on the circumstances, but to the extent that even if the incumbent wins the primary, shows some vulnerability, if it's a close race, that could give some momentum in general to the other side, particularly if there is a well-funded challenger who has some ability to get on the ground and organize people and get people out to vote. So that will be interesting to see. And one of the things that's interesting in these local races is there's not a lot of good data or evidence out there about what's really happening. A lot of it is anecdotal, which is the best we have, but it's hard to know exactly how people see the mayor, for example, in terms of polling and things like that. So we don't have too much to go on, but it certainly could be an issue for him.
And so, Representative Giarrusso, you're looking ahead towards November. I was there this afternoon when Mayor Fung cast his vote in Cranston along with his wife, and one of the questions that came from the press, as they always do, is the Trump question. Alan said, look, thinks he's doing well from the economic side of things, but he himself is his own man and will not let the administration dictate his policies or any of his actions. What do you hear out there of Rhode Islanders and Trump, especially within the Republican Party?
I get confused a lot of times how someone wants to paint a picture and say, are you in line with Trump or whoever the president might be? Because the last time I checked, the State House is where the governor is, and I don't think I've ever seen a president go in that building to tell the governor what to do. So I have a hard time drawing that parallel. I could see how if someone has a negative connotation, then perhaps they want to paint a picture like, look, you're like that negative person. So I think it's wise to just let the president be the president and you're running for governor.
And on the Democratic side of things, though, the whole Democratic Party is united in their opposition to the president. So here you have a Republican side that has a fine line to walk, and a lot of the candidates, as you mentioned, talk about being their own candidate and focused here on Rhode Island. Do you think that holds true?
Yeah, I think that this idea of linking someone's perception of a national leader like the president to these local and state level races is problematic, but some people often do. And they kind of take out oftentimes their frustration or opposition with national conditions and national leaders on the local or state level. It's interesting on the Democratic side that certainly I think there's tons of unity against the president right now. However, they have their own internal divisions on the Democratic side. You see that nationally. You're seeing that play out a bit in Rhode Island as well, with some of these challengers more from the left and the progressive side. It'll be interesting to see if any of those folks gain some momentum or even potentially pick off a race or two here, because that might be a signal
Yes.
We
to.
are calling this race Raimondo win with 64% of the primary vote.
Okay, getting the information here right now, breaking, calling the race. Governor Gina Raimondo emerging from the Democratic primary with 64% of the vote. We'll have more of that up on GoLocal shortly here. So now it's a fait accompli, at least on the Democratic side. So I want to talk to you, Representative, about what you hear. Again, you're focusing on the general, but what do you hear from folks in your district about the current Raimondo administration?
Believe it or not, I hear more complaints from the Democrats in my district because they can't forgive her for what she did to their pension. And they all understand that sometimes you have to make some concessions, but they think that a lot of those concessions were squandered with all these six-figure jobs and the free tuition and things like that that could have gone to adjust the COLAs that they were not given for the past 7-8 years, whatever it's been, that they haven't received the COLA.
We've seen signs across the state. They've already popped up. ABG. Was the original ABC anyone but Carolina? Was that the first? I didn't harken back to basketball days. We've seen the ABG around the state quite often. So, Matt, do you think, to Representative Giarrusso's point, that disaffected Democrat who might be very upset with the current governor, you're faced with only a finite amount of choices in the general election. Is that enough to move some Democrats?
It could be. It's an interesting situation. I think, if anything, it's more likely to maybe depress some turnout, people not wanting to necessarily vote.
A protest.
Yeah, kind of a protest.
And there's no Bob Healy protest
Right.
vote this time.
Exactly. No one to protest vote for, perhaps, but protest by staying home. So that'll be really important. And I do think that the governor is vulnerable, not only because of the pension issue, but just unusually low approval ratings, I think, for someone in the kind of conditions that we have in Rhode Island. So that will be very interesting to see.
So 64%, as GoLocal just reported, Governor Gina Raimondo emerging from the Democratic primary victorious. To the general perception, it seemed like a close campaign between Matt and the governor.
It seemed that way, yes.
Do you think that carries over into the general election?
I'm not sure. The only thing that I can say is a good thing for her is that the other side didn't have the financing to go negative. So a lot of times these people, they kind of eat their own in a primary, and they get beaten around with all the negatives, and it hurts in the general. But I didn't see a single negative ad about her for the whole election cycle.
Matt, back in 16 with Bernie and Hillary, obviously a lot of upset Bernie voters who said no way to Hillary.
Yeah.
Let's talk about that phenomenon. Was that unique in that sort of national race? But as you said, it takes the individual to make that decision and the protest. Again, would you see that replicated here?
There may be an element of that here. I mean, probably not on the scale that we saw in 2016 at the national level, but I do think that sentiment is real, and I think that, for example, Sanders himself endorsed Reaganburg, and so, that kind of sense that, there's a kind of progressive activism here and energy that could be, is upset with the governor and what she seems to represent, that could play a role here for sure.
And one can only guess, unless we had Bernie Sanders here in the studio with us tonight. We had reached out to Matt Brown's camp probably about a week ago and asked, are you seeking Bernie Sanders' endorsement? And the response was that the response happened to be he doesn't endorse challengers to sitting Democrats, and then we see Aaron Ruggenberg. I mean, why do you think that he couldn't get it seemed like Matt Brown was turning the pages of the Bernie Sanders playbook.
It did seem that way, and I really don't have a good answer to that question. I mean, sometimes these decisions are as, just speculating a little, as strategic as they are about ideology or ideas that, maybe the Lieutenant Governor's challenger was more seen as a better bet in a way, having a better chance to win. And, you really want to endorse people who you feel, given the conditions, right, have a chance to be really credible. And maybe given his underfunded nature, Brown's, that was a factor, but I'm only speculating.
Now, I do want to ask, we do have some resources behind us. New numbers emerging in the Raimondo race.
56-34 with 86% reporting across the state.
Okay, we now have updated numbers. It is 56-34 with just over 80% reporting across the state.
McKee Ruggenberg within half a percentage, 50.7 to 49.3.
And just hearing now the updates as well, McKee and Ruggenberg within a half of percentage point between 50.7 and 49.3, I believe, with how much reporting?
That's also with 86%.
That's with 86 reporting, so.
Fung 56.2, Morgan 40%.
Okay, and we're hearing Fung 56.2 to Morgan 40%. So too close to call in Lieutenant Governor's race. It looks like Raimondo and Fung, with again about 80% reporting, having significant leads over their opponents. So let me just ask you before we let you go here, Representative. You talked about the Democrats in your district being upset with Raimondo. But let's go to the Republican side. If it looks like Fung's emerging and it's a Fung-Raimondo race, what do you think are going to be the key factors?
I think people will look at what has the current administration done in the time that she was here for 4 years, and would some of those policies have been enacted if Fung had won 4 years ago? And I think they should be energized, because even if they were supporting Morgan or Ferrocci, I think that's irrelevant, because I think that the Republicans will wholeheartedly support whichever Republican comes out of the race tonight.
And do you envision a staunch campaign, perhaps, that a vote for Trillo is a vote for Raimondo amongst the Republican Party?
I think so, absolutely. It's going to be deja vu all over again.
A very different protest candidate than Bob Healy, but Rhode Island is no stranger to three-way races in the general. Do you think Trillo goes through to the final day?
I think he does.
Yeah.
I mean, he ruined his boat over this. I mean, what else can he do?
He's got money to spare. Well, again, the number is coming in here. Lieutenant Governor's race, too close to call. Raimondo, 56-34 with 80% reporting. Fund 5640. I believe the full numbers will be available on golocalprov.com. But we appreciate your tuning in for this live coverage here in the Navigant Credit Union Broadcast Center. I appreciate picking the top political brains between Representative Anthony Giarrusso. Thank you so much.
You're welcome.
And Matt Guardino, professor of political science at Providence College, who we've had the opportunity to quote in articles before, but never in studio. So I want to thank you for coming down the hill here to Providence.
Thank you.
And don't go anywhere. We're going to be back with our next guests here, including former Governor Lincoln Chafee. So don't go anywhere. We'll be back here at the